You're listening to On Shifting Ground from Commonwealth Club World Affairs and KQED. I'm Ray Suarez. Last month, when we broadcast our first election special, we tried to answer this. Why are Americans feeling so bad about the direction of our country? And we asked whether the data actually backs up their fears about everything, from the economy to whether our biggest institutions actually work. We went directly to an Iowa voter who believed this country has seen better days, and we asked him what was at stake in the 2024 presidential election. When I talked to Phil Hemingway in late January, he'd already made the hard decision to close down his auto repair shop, a business he owned and operated for over 30 years. As he described it, his business was crippled by creeping inflation and Biden's misguided economic policy. Last week, we went back to Phil for an update after he listened to the whole episode. Did anything he heard from our other guests change his mind? Here's how that went.
I guess my first take on it was the French Revolution, let them eat cake. It's not imaginary what I'm going through and what others are going through. I mean, I'm not unique. That's one thing that I guess in talking with a lot of my contemporaries that are in small business owners and things like that, it's the same for everybody. My biggest takeaway from them is that, things are much better than people think. It's like, well, if it is, it's sure not evidence to build blue-collar workers like me. My wife says, walk a mile in my shoes. Yeah, that would be something, He can shoulder my load and tell me that I'm not seeing the whole picture. But no, it's real. It's not just me. It's many people. And it is affecting certain communities even worse.
As we began planning the second episode of the series, the question of whether the U.S. should be providing assistance to Ukraine's military was dividing Congress and the rest of the country along party lines. So we asked Phil, a loyal Republican voter, does foreign affairs matter to you in the upcoming election?
We can't be isolationists. That I've seen what it's like in other places, and there is an interaction. We are a global community, but we have to pay attention to what's going on at home, and it's important that we not ignore that when we're selecting the leader of our country.
The process of selecting our next potential commander-in-chief moved to South Carolina February 24th. By the time you're hearing this program, Donald Trump has likely carried the primary in a landslide. And in the coming days, Nikki Haley may be talking with her team about whether and why to stay in the campaign for the Republican nomination. On the Democratic side, the primary in South Carolina was held weeks ago, and in the lead-up, the Biden administration carried out extensive outreach to galvanize the state's black electorate. The black vote was key to Biden's victory in 2020, and it was the voting bloc that may have saved his campaign 4 years ago. In 2024, he won South Carolina again, thanks to voters like Maryann Wright.
I'm very proud to be a Geechee Gullah gal, as we say, from the Low Country. And I've been involved in every election since I moved here. I am also very active in a sorority. I'm a member of the oldest black sorority in the world. As an Alpha Kappa Alpha sorority member, our motto is service to all mankind. So that really does fit with how I see my position, my place in the world.
Maryann is a 70-year-old retired teacher, hard at work in her community. She's hoping to ensure that come November, the Biden-Harris ticket remains a winning one.
I'm feeling very confident that President Biden and Vice President Harris will win re-election. And I'm doing everything I can, along with a whole lot of other people, to get the message out there that this administration has really done a fabulous job. The number of jobs created, the low unemployment rate. It's under, I think, 4%. Like this is, I think, the lowest unemployment rate for African Americans in several decades. Capping the price of insulin, the child tax credit, is that it? I mean, what a benefit that was to young families. And it lifted so many children out of poverty and gave them an opportunity, a step up.
Maryann inherited her voter activism from her father, who knew firsthand what it was like to have a voice silenced.
When he went to vote for the first time, there were about 5 or 6 white men in the polling places with shotguns. And of course, that was an intimidation tactic. My dad made a hasty retreat. He didn't get to vote that day, but he never gave up. And eventually, when he was able to vote, he made sure that everyone in the community had an opportunity to vote.
But the growing movement to turn back the clock, the professed nostalgia for earlier times in American history, has Maryann worried the hard-earned rights her father sacrificed for are at risk.
If you don't know it by now, these young people or these people who said they're not going to vote, politics controls everything in your life. There isn't any aspect of your life that is not affected by politics. You know, I grew up in South Carolina, and I went to segregated schools all the way up until my senior year. So I know about the white and colored restrooms and the white and colored water fountains. So I know what that's like. But because we got together and we organized and we voted, we were able to make a change. And that's the only way that we're going to change things in this country. Democracy is worth fighting for, and our vote is our voice, and that's how we're going to fight to keep democracy in this country.
The prospect of a Biden-Trump rematch has left some voters apathetic about the entire political process, and Biden's policy wins might be overlooked by an electorate impatient for change.
My generation, we know what the record looks like, but for some of the younger voters, there seems to be somewhat of a disconnect, and they feel like they're being cheated. But what we need to do is give them another term, another 4 years to stay the course, and we'll see the results, because we're already seeing the results.
As voters wait for the effects of these policies to trickle down, calls for additional funding to defend borders and defend democracies has many Americans wondering just how much it's going to cost them to foot the bill. And in an election that's expected to come down to a few thousand votes in a few key states, the looming threat of escalating conflict in Europe, the Middle East, and Taiwan is forcing even the most inwardly looking voters to turn outward. And these international flashpoints have drawn domestic concerns into a larger debate: the role of American democracy at home and America's responsibilities abroad.
As the leader of the free world, and I really do see us that way as a democracy, we're the leader of the free world. It's important for us to give aid to Ukraine. It's not something that we can just yank away and say we're not going to do it any longer. And I know there are people who are saying, well, we have homeless veterans here, but we're giving all this money to Ukraine. And they take exception to that. And I understand to a certain degree, but we have a certain responsibility. And one of them is to make sure that we're putting our money where democracy is going to have an opportunity to take root.
This election cycle, America's levels of engagement in the wars overseas, financially, militarily, and morally, may be on the ballot as much as inflation, gun violence, healthcare, education, or reproductive rights. And while this has the potential to split the country along regional lines and generations, Maryann still hopes that her party will consider the bigger picture.
I've never been a single issue voter. One of the things that I would try to get the younger voters to see, that what's going on in the Middle East with Israel and Gaza is not an ideal situation. But the other things that we have going on are important and they're substantive and they make a difference in the lives of Americans. So even though they may be one particular aspect that is not up to par or maybe not up to your liking or your desire, there are other issues that are as important as well here at home.
Come November, how much will America's role abroad sway voters? Joining me now is an expert on American foreign policy and perhaps one of the most qualified people to answer that question: why international affairs will matter in November. Wendy Sherman has watched the interplay of domestic and international politics from a unique perch from inside the State Department, where she worked for over 30 years and worked in the administrations of 3 presidents and 5 secretaries of state. She's a former Deputy Secretary of State and worked in the Biden administration until her retirement last summer. Wendy Sherman, welcome to On Shifting Ground.
Thank you. Great to be with you, Ray.
Well, I can't tell you the number of times campaign people have told me over the years that foreign policy doesn't win elections, that a focus by a senator or a member of the House on America's role abroad can hurt you depending on events, but it can't help you very much. Have you heard similar?
Of course. I think that's the conventional wisdom. And in fact, I think that this upcoming presidential election will be decided on how people are feeling about their personal finances, about how they look to the future, and what they see in the character of the candidates. But what I think is different this time is that there are some issues which cross over between domestic and national security and foreign policy. And those are ones that will be consequential for the vote.
Give us some examples.
Well, obviously, the most obvious one and the one most on Americans' minds right now is the economy, whether, in fact, prices will come down at the grocery store, whether inflation will stay tamed, whether the Federal Reserve will lower interest rates. And that is, of course, all tied to our economy, but it's also tied to the world economy because we trade with people all over the world. So what happens to their economies, whether they can accept our exports or not, helps to ensure that we have the robust economy that we do currently have. The second one, which is very much on people's minds, is immigration. We've just seen the most extraordinary moment where the Republicans in Congress very much wanted border security tied to any kind of foreign aid, and then decided they didn't want it after all, even after a bipartisan group in the Senate negotiated a really tough immigration border security bill. So Americans very much have this on their minds, and so this crosses over between international relations and domestic policy.
Literally, like trying to step over a border. But I'm glad you brought up immigration because I think it's a perfect distillation of what we're talking about this hour on the program. There are crises, national meltdowns in Haiti, in Venezuela, in Cuba. And while Secretary Mayorkas and Vice President Harris and from time to time President Biden have spoken directly to the countries involved and their leaders and said, look, stop creating conditions that send people here. Said to the people in various countries that are in crisis, don't come. This won't be good for you. They don't really deliver that message very effectively to a domestic audience, that the United States is working to create conditions where people don't pick up out of desperation and make their way to the border.
I understand that's how people are feeling, and certainly there are mayors around the country which are feeling it very much so. But in fact, there has been a lot of work going on to try to help those governments, not only in Central America, but as you note, in Haiti and in Venezuela. And quite frankly, we just want to manage immigration in a sensible and well-considered way. So we want people to stay home, take a very careful approach to how they do this, understanding that there are lots of parents who are terrified of the gangs in their country or looking for a better way forward, or have very legitimate asylum claims that they are going to be tortured, persecuted, assaulted in ways that we would agree necessitates their leaving their country.
I am perfectly willing to grant that the United States, and over the course of several administrations, has been working hard in other places in the world to try to get people not to make unauthorized crossings. What I'm wondering is if our own leaders, elected and appointed, talk to Americans enough about those things that we're doing in other places to give them a sense that this is not something that's just happening to the country without any control or any oversight, but something that we're going to bring you in on our process. We're going to talk to you about what we're doing because we want you to understand it.
Ray, I agree with you. We should talk about this more. The sad part is there's a lot of political noise in a presidential election year, and that presidential noise is drowning out reality. The fact that there was a very, very tough border bill, very tough, that could have passed if it were not for one presidential candidate, Donald Trump, likely the nominee for the Republican Party, telling members of the Senate and the House, don't do it. I want it as a campaign issue. We cannot decide policy on the basis of leaving things for a campaign issue any more that we can leave things to a decision by a leader in a foreign country like Vladimir Putin to decide what's in America's best interests. We have to do what we need to do for our country. And we sent our members of Congress to Washington to solve problems, not just run for the next election.
The people in the State Department who represent America abroad, who try to bring America's objectives to people elsewhere in the world and help them understand it, have a tough job. But I wonder if it would have helped more. You spent a big chunk of your adult life in the foreign policy sphere. If officials in the United States tried harder to create domestic constituencies for various approaches, that American people felt like they were part of the process, that they had an investment, that it implicated them in some way rather than just something they would be told about after a decision was made.
I agree with you, Ray. We should have much more conversation about what's going on in the world. But I'm also realistic. People live their day-to-day lives, and they want to make sure they can feed their families. They want to make sure that they can have a better life for their kids than they've had for themselves. They want to have good jobs. They want to enjoy their community. And so it's hard to get people to focus on this. I think programs like yours, who focus on these issues and make the connections to Americans' day-to-day lives, are really what are enormously helpful conversations. And yes, political leaders should talk about it more. But again, we are really in what's often called the silly season, where folks are all about re-election and not about solving problems.
When I think back to when I was a kid, and a kid who was very interested in the news, presidents quite often would requisition network airtime and sort of walk people. More often than not, it was issues of war and peace, so certainly the stakes felt heightened. It felt big, it felt important, but it also felt like the president thought, I have to tell people about this. It's big enough that I have to tell people about this. Yes, I understand the economy of attention has changed. I understand what we consider people's bandwidth has changed, but I don't I can't recall the same sense of momentousness about, well, helping Ukraine or various things that consecutive presidents have done where they're just not bringing us in on it. And I know it's hard to do, and I know it's hard to know when to pull the trigger on something like asking the networks for airtime. But there must have been some times at the State Department where you thought, I wish we had a little help on this.
Well, I think, Ray, there are a number of factors that didn't exist when you and I were kids. And I think, probably even a little older than you are. For one, the president has spoken to immigration. He has spoken about Ukraine. He has spoken about the fact that the House won't take up the national security bill that was just passed by the Senate with quite a strong margin. He's spoken to all of these things. But you have to be very careful about how many times you use that Oval Office address, because as you know, you have to ask for network time. And secondly, we live in not a time that you and I were kids when there were 3 television channels and everybody watched them. And so you knew you would have a captive audience if you did that Oval Office speech. Now, quite frankly, most people probably don't pay attention to network news, including wonderful NPR, unless it's really a tradition they've had. Young people live their lives on podcasts. I know my own daughter spends more time probably on podcasts than she does watching any television address, and she's a very attuned and very active young professional. So we're just live in a different time where communication is much more complicated. And so reaching people, getting them to understand, it can't just be an Oval Office address. It has to be using all the media tools that we have, which makes it feel like the conversation's not happening, when many times it is.
Just what you laid out is a perfect explanation for what we face as communicators. How can it be different? How should it be different? Should ideally Americans go to the polls either in primary states in the coming weeks or to the general elections in November with a greater sense of what we're up to and why? Should the voters be working harder? And should others be working harder to court them, to bring them in on the process?
I think we all have to be working harder, both as citizens and as communicators. There's no question that, as editor-in-chief of The Economist said on The Daily Show with Jon Stewart, that the United States is supporting our own security by providing aid to Ukraine, particularly military assistance. We're not putting our own soldiers on the line. And quite frankly, that military assistance money is fueling our own military-industrial complex because it's creating jobs here in America to produce weapons for Ukraine to make use of. So it is critical for our own security that we make sure that Putin cannot continue his horrifying, illegal attempt to invade a sovereign country. It is critical that the president, the Secretary of State, Secretary of Defense, everybody else continue to talk about how much we are trying to pressure Israel to ensure that whatever actions they take in self-defense, given the just really awful assault by Hamas, a terrorist group, on October 7th, that Israel do what it needs to in its self-defense, but not at the expense of Palestinian civilians. I don't think there's anyone who isn't pained deeply by how many Palestinians and how many Palestinian children have died in the effort to ensure that Israel has its security. And the president is continuing to press the leaders of Israel to think very hard and to consider much more carefully what they are doing. And we are actively have participated in negotiations to try to get a return of the hostages that are still in Gaza, while at the same time putting in place a 6-week ceasefire or pause, which, quite frankly, I think most of us hope will create a space for a political resolution that will mean the end of this terrible situation.
For a long time, it was assumed that there were domestic constituencies for certain aspects of American foreign policy. But America, when that assumption was being made, was a lot less complicated place than it is today. As America has gotten more diverse and more complicated in the post-1965 era of immigration, has our foreign policy establishment also become more diverse in the way that it consults domestic constituencies about overseas activity by the United States?
There's probably some truth to that point, Ray, and I would add to it generational differences. The way I, as a 74-year-old Jewish American, feel differently about Israel and the Middle East, perhaps, than my 40-year-old daughter, and certainly differently than people in their 20s. So there have been generational changes, just as there have been generational changes around social issues in our country. And so one has to take that difference into account as well. And quite frankly, no ethnic group, no religious group believe all the same thing. All Americans don't believe the same thing. We are fundamentally a country of very diverse people. And some of the anxiousness that we are seeing among some of our citizens is because they feel the country they once knew has changed dramatically. And it is true. We have changed. We have evolved. Our social customs have changed. And for some people, that's a scary thing, but it is actually what has made us so strong and resilient over all of these years.
If we accept as a given that it would be a good thing for democracy and a good thing for the way that we run elections, that American voters were more concerned with what the country does in their name overseas. We on the program are talking from time to time to a voter named Phil in Iowa. What's the pitch to Phil? Like, your input matters in this too. What would you say to bring him along?
I think I'd listen first. Phil, what's most on your mind? What are you thinking about for yourself, for your family? What issues are you most worried about? And then I'd key off of what Phil is concerned about, whether that's the economy, whether that is immigration, whether that's the price of groceries, whether that's the social change he's seeing in his neighborhood, whether our country is moving to consider electing someone who, in my view, at the very least, would be an autocrat. So I think I'd start with listening to Phil. I think it's really, really important. And when I was at the State Department working for Secretary Blinken, I traveled domestically as well as internationally, as does the Secretary of State, and he encourages everyone to travel domestically as well to do exactly what you're saying, which is be in conversation with the citizens of this country. Listen to them, try to explain things, answer their questions.
In all aspects of policymaking, right now, when pollsters talk to voters, voters tell them they feel alienated from the machinery that makes decisions, that they feel that they're not being consulted, that they feel that they're not being heard. Is foreign affairs one part of our common life where they really could make a difference if they wanted to have the same kind of input that they would have on the price of gasoline or the sort of bread and butter issues that we assume are part of every family's deliberations?
Well, I think the price of gasoline is very much a national security issue and very much tied to where we're going on energy, not just in the United States, but around the world. We haven't talked about climate change, which for young people, when I taught at Harvard Kennedy School, climate change and social justice were the top two issues. And quite frankly, climate change and social justice are connected not only to domestic values, but to international values as well, and who we are as the United States of America, because the world watches. So we are connected to each other. So we really have to think about who we are, how we are, what's most on people's minds, and then connect that to what's going on around the world.
These are great examples because they also illustrate that even if in our working models that we bring out the front door with us every day when we go to work haven't changed that much, America's interconnectedness to the world has changed a great deal. Is that an opening that policymakers have not taken enough advantage of in saying, look, I get that you think this is a complicated world. Let's talk about these things and the way we as Americans are implicated in them?
I certainly think there's always more that we can do, Ray. No question about it. So I think there's a whole lot of work to be done at all levels, including by diplomats and leaders of our national security and foreign policy arena. So I agree with you on that. But I also understand and appreciate that people lead very complicated lives and are much more focused on what's happening around their kitchen table. And so that's why I say one has to start with where people are and to listen to them and then try to connect that and those concerns to how it's connected to the rest of the world.
Wendy Sherman retired from a long career in helping make America's foreign policy just last summer, and she joined us on Shifting Ground. Great to have you with us.
Great to be with you. Thanks so much, Ray.
You're listening to On Shifting Ground, produced by World Affairs in San Francisco. After the break, New York Times columnist Nicholas Kristof on why Americans are so divided over international affairs and what it takes to care about the other. If you missed any part of this episode or want to catch up on other international stories, download our podcast on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. This is On Shifting Ground. I'm Ray Suarez. Coming into the South Carolina primary, two major international events were dominating the news cycle: the escalating violence in Gaza and the second anniversary of Russia's invasion of Ukraine, the latter falling the same day as the Republican vote. Tucker Carlson's recent interview with Russian President Vladimir Putin has divided Americans along party lines, as more Republican voters question why the United States is providing aid to Ukraine's military, and why NATO, a European defense organization, deserves any assistance from the U.S. whatsoever. Against this backdrop, we reached out to an expert on politics, international affairs, and the impact of media. I'm joined now by journalist and political commentator Nicholas Kristof. He's a winner of 2 Pulitzer Prizes. He's an op-ed columnist for the New York Times and a regular CNN contributor. He's written extensively about the state of American democracy and, more importantly, the health of our American electorate. Nicholas Kristof, welcome to On Shifting Ground.
Great to be with you, Ray.
We are periodically talking to regular guys, rank-and-file voters across the year, and one, Phil from Iowa, has been unmoved by evidence that we lay at his feet to suggest that maybe things aren't as bad as people feel. It's tough to pierce that bubble. Do you find that?
Yeah, I mean, for decades, there's been abundant evidence that reality is very much filtered through who's in office at that moment. And we're seeing that right now. There are mixed signals about the economy, but in general, things are actually looking pretty good. But a lot of voters certainly don't perceive that.
If a lot of Americans have their heels dug in based on ideology, so giving them the latest unemployment numbers or evidence of moderating inflation or lower gas prices isn't really going to move the needle that much, do we have a conceptual problem in the way that we're talking to and about voters?
You know, one thing that I notice, Ray, is that this is not an American problem. This is a global problem, or at least it's a problem among Western industrial democracies. Biden seems very unpopular in the U.S., and we think that is because, for example, that he's elderly. And maybe it is. There's some evidence for that. But on the other hand, who's even less popular than Joe Biden? It's the Prime Minister of Britain, the President of France, the Prime Minister of Japan, and so on all around the world. And there's a sourness in Western advanced democracies toward their leaders, toward the incumbents. And I wonder if our president were a younger man, were a Kennedy, if people would be saying that's probably because, he's young and inexperienced, the way people might say that about Macron in France. Historically, as you know, we've tended to think that the way we cover things is we quote somebody from one side and then quote somebody from the other side, and that, we emphasize fairness. And fairness is an important value, but I think maybe the most fundamental value of all is truth, and that we should share that truth. And sometimes there is a tension between those two. I think that we should be very careful to relay an accurate understanding and make sure that what we know to be the truth is conveyed. And that isn't always served simply by quoting somebody on one side and the other side.
If you're in the morning editorial meeting and something comes up that's counterintuitive, something comes up that people generally don't know, that's given a lot of value. But I'm finding now, for years this has been the case, people don't want to hear things they don't know. They don't want to hear that, in fact, their understanding of an issue of current controversy is flawed because actually the underpinnings of the argument we've misunderstood them as a people, as a press, as politicians. They're just not interested. And I sometimes just get a little stuck. I think, well, what's the play here?
There is some social psychology research that has been substantiated many times that goes to this and that I always think about in this context. And it essentially invited a bunch of voters. The first version was by mail do you want this kind of information? And they were offered various kinds of free information. And some of it was information that would appeal to that they would agree with, some that would challenge their views, and others that was from the other side, but kind of ridiculous points of view. And what it turns out is that basically what we most want to get is arguments from the other side that make them look ridiculous and silly and stupid. What we next want to get is strong arguments buttressing our own biases and prejudices. And what we least want to get, whether we're liberal or conservative or whatever, is smart ideas and views that critique our own, that challenge our assumptions. I commend that approach to others, not because it's pleasant, but because I think it helps to break down these filters of selection bias that we all have around us.
One thing that we're covering in this stretch of weeks is the old nostrum that I've heard countless times from campaign managers, consultants, political pros, that foreign policy can hurt you when you're a candidate, but it can rarely help you. Demonstrating expertise, demonstrating familiarity with the world outside the United States. So there's a kind of arm's length involvement that a lot of politicians are doing right now. Yet the United States is involved up to its eye teeth in the world, whether it comes to trade or the keeping the sea lanes open so that countries can get their oil, or the things that we are involved with in trying to stop terrorism. American service people are in places all over the globe. We're there, yet there's this hesitancy to talk to people about it. Is it hard to get Americans to care about foreign policy?
Yeah, it is. And I don't think it's just a new phenomenon. You think about British voters renouncing Winston Churchill after the war, when he had just won the war for them. Or you think about George H.W. Bush in 1992. He had just managed the first Gulf War really quite brilliantly. And I think that since then, even there's been a greater sense of maybe retreat from the world, a sense of frustration, a sense of fatigue with international affairs. I think the Afghan and Iraq wars both led to this just sense of how difficult it is to impose our will on the world. The fact that we could be defeated in Afghanistan was kind of staggering. I think that's unfortunate because if one mistake that we've historically made has been to waltz off and get involved in conflicts in which we have no business getting involved in, like Iraq or like Vietnam, then another mistake, has been a lack of engagement. Bill Clinton said that his biggest foreign policy mistake was not helping to stop the Rwanda genocide. I think that is fair. I think that's true. And, I'm, I've got to say, Ray, I think that one of the really heroic American achievements of the last 100 years was the establishment of the post-World War II international order with NATO, the international trade structures, and that helped keep the peace. And it pains me that today Donald Trump would like to, it sounds like, withdraw from NATO, and in ways that I think would be a huge step backward and endanger the world and reduce deterrence. And, one thing we should have learned from Ukraine is that deterrence is a lot cheaper than war.
You're an internationalist. I feel comfortable saying that. In a lot of your journalism, you have gone really small when telling overseas stories to highlight the reality of lived experience among regular people in other places in the world. Is that one of the ways that we can pick this lock and maybe engage American voters more effectively?
The reason I go small goes back to the Darfur crisis. And I was covering these massacres and writing these columns, and it just felt like my columns were just sinking into the water without a ripple. And so I went into the research about what makes people care. And it's fundamentally about two things. It's about individual stories. We have compassion and empathy for individuals, but not for classes of people. And the second is that people want to believe that if they get engaged, there can be a positive difference. They don't just want to hear about horrible things happening somewhere that are tragedies. And I think that in journalism and in the nonprofit sector, people often focus on terrible things happening, but without that sense of actually an arc of progress or hope in the backdrop that actually gives one a sense of efficacy, that there can be a narrative of progress. I would like to see more journalism and nonprofit work talk about some of these micro cases, individual cases, to illustrate the broader possibilities of progress.
Do you look forward to covering the race that's about to unfold, or is it sort of a jaw-clenching duty rolling out over the next 8 months or so?
I think it's going to be immensely important and consequential for the country. And so in that sense, I am eager to wade into it. I also think that my side, if you will, that, liberals often almost go out of their way to lose votes by coming across as condescending to working class voters, by, speaking down to them. I'm just really pained by the degree to which educated voters the left has managed to drive off working class voters, originally white working class voters, and increasingly working class voters of color. And I think that those educated voters feel a certain arrogance toward the working class voters in a way that drives them into the arms of people like Trump.
Joe Biden has said many times in the last 6 months that the coming election is about the preservation of American democracy. Are the stakes that high? And if they are you optimistic about the future of American democracy?
Look, I don't think that if Donald Trump were elected, I don't think I'd be shipped off to Guantanamo. I don't think we would become China. I don't think we would become a dictatorship exactly. And, Hitler metaphors should be banned forever in this context. But I look at Hungary, for example, or Poland, or other countries that I have seen slide away from democracy. And it's a spectrum. I can very easily see us moving in that spectrum to become less democratic. I think we already did in the first Trump term. And, what does that mean? It means the civil service in the U.S. becomes much more politicized. It means the Department of Justice becomes a tool of the president. It means that military commanders are promoted based in part on their politics and their willingness to maybe crush protests, for example. It means that there may be a rise in political violence and that it becomes difficult to get 12 jurors to all agree unanimously to convict somebody who is committed an act of political violence because somebody is going to sympathize with that person. And that would be a real and terrible slide backward for our country, a historic backward step. It's not a dictatorship, but is it less democratic? Absolutely. And, a real setback for this country and for the world.
Stepping back and not condescendingly telling anybody something they don't know because I'm a smart guy and they're not. When I hear the big applause, for instance, at the former president's rallies as he promises to immediately begin deporting 10 to 12 million people, I know what that looks like. And I know that even some of the people applauding that today, when they see it on television, are going to be horrified. That the actual vision of people in uniforms dragging, screaming, crying, resisting people into vans and getting them out of the country is not going to be something that a lot of the people who abstractly say they're for it really want to see. And yet there is loud and rocking applause at some of these rallies for that idea. Is there a way to run a campaign that is realistic and talks humanely about what real people are really like? I don't know.
I think that there are. I think it's difficult. I think immigration is a particularly difficult challenge. But I think that one important distinction is for Democrats to take aim at the craziness of the first Trump administration and the even greater craziness that I think would be, and cruelty that be represented by a second Trump administration, but not to then go the next step, which Democrats sometimes do, and imply that every Trump voter is a racist and a bigot. I think it's really hard to win the votes of people who one is accusing of being racist and bigots. And I also think that we should avoid stereotypes of any community. I'm living in rural Oregon now in an area where there are mostly Trump voters. And, people are complicated. I have one friend who is a very fervent Trump supporter. And why is she a Trump supporter? Well, she feels betrayed by what she thinks of as elites. She was homeless for 7 years. I think 4 of her family members killed themselves. She once put a gun to her head. She really suffered. And there is something to the idea that Democrats and Republicans alike were not thoughtful enough about the impact of policies on working class Americans. And so then when Trump comes along and points to scapegoats and blames it and says, we're going to bring factories back and so on, then she hears that as speaking to her and being willing to solve her problems. And I think that if people on the left can talk about the minimum wage, can talk about childcare, can talk about some of these arguments that resonate with them, can avoid sounding disrespectful about faith, I think that those things, can help. I think that is possible.
Well, Nicholas Kristof, before I let you go, maybe you could give me the elevator pitch for idealism. I think idealism has gotten a pretty rough ride over this past generation. People feel let down and disappointed by their public servants, and a little more hope and a little more belief that people actually do go into this with goodwill might go a long way. Can you get me to the 10th floor with some words of encouragement about November?
So I think there's a lot of despair right now. I have a memoir actually coming out in May called Chasing Hope. And it's because, look, I'm a guy who has had a career covering war and genocide and poverty and disease. And I have emerged from that, covering these terrible things with a certain amount of hope. And that's because I have seen this backdrop of progress that we don't always acknowledge. And part of that is, look, when I graduated from college, 41% of the world's population was living in extreme poverty. Now about 8% is. The number of children who die each day has plunged. Maybe that's the worst thing that can happen to anybody, is to lose a child. That is a much more rare event today. And I also think that, and again, maybe this goes to flaws in journalism, but we cover the terrible things that happen. But what I found is that side by side with the worst of humanity, you invariably find the best. And when we are tested, we humans are capable of just extraordinary courage and decency and resilience and strength. I think of Putin and Navalny in Russia. And Putin has exemplified for decades the human capacity to crush others, to pursue ambition at the expense of others. Navalny demonstrated the human capacity to sacrifice, to try to bring about change, and he lost his life in that. But I do believe that someday there will be a Navalny statue in Moscow and not a Putin statue. And that is because ideals and ideas, at the end of the day, sometimes it's a long day, do tend to emerge triumphant.
Nicholas Kristof of the New York Times, thanks for joining us on Shifting Ground.
Great to be with you.
As a reminder, this is our second episode in our year-long election series. Next month, we'll look at the politics of reproductive rights and how gaining a seat on the Supreme Court may be the most important issue for many voters.
I do consider myself to be a Christian, and I believe that God has given us free will, and with that free will, we are able to do what we want within reason. And I believe that part of that free will that we're given is that a woman has the right to choose what she's going to do with her body.
You've been listening to On Shifting Ground, produced in partnership with KQED, with funding from listeners like you. Today's episode was produced by Sienna Barnes, Elise Manukian, and Matteo Schimpf. It was mixed and mastered by Matteo Schimpf. Additional production and engineering were provided by Rob Spate. KQED's Jim Bennett is our technical supervisor. Jared Spord is our executive producer. Philip Yun is co-CEO of Commonwealth Club World Affairs. Our music is from Blue Dot Sessions. I'm Ray Suarez. Thanks for listening.